Republicans' biggest attack line against Democrats so far in the 2020 race can really be summed up in one word, it would seem: radical. They're trying to tell the country that the Biden campaign is too radical to run America. I asked Senator Kamala Harris about that label in my conversation. Perhaps you've heard one of the chief criticisms of the Biden-Harris ticket by some is you're radical. You're a radical liberal. And then last week at the convention, there was Senator Sanders. He got up and he applauded you and the vice president for your stance on climate change and the minimum wage and union rights. But then you also had the former governor of Ohio, John Kasich. You had Michael Bloomberg, one of the wealthiest men on earth. And you had General Colin Powell endorse
Carly Fiorina.
Right. And then there were some who were saying, oh, they're not liberal enough. They're too centrist. Which is it? Or is it we can be whatever we want because we're just not Donald Trump? Is that going to be the central argument for the next 68 days?
The most important point I think that can be made about the diversity of who we are is an embrace for the diversity of who we are. And that's who we are as Democrats. We embrace the diversity of who we are. We're not requiring people to march and fall in line.
You may have heard our next guest name dropped there. Carly Fiorina ran for president as a Republican in 2016. She's also, of course, the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, and she's voting for Joe Biden. Carly, good to see you again. Thanks for your time. That word radical, repeated over and over again by the president, repeated by the president and his allies. What's your advice, Carly, to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on how to best address that label?
Well, you know, I think one of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's great challenges, and I think they're up to it, is not to respond to everything that Donald Trump says. I think that serves Donald Trump's interests to have him be able to set the parameters of the debate. I think what Joe Biden needs to do is to continue to talk about who he is, as demonstrated through a lifetime, a person of humility, of empathy, someone who actually is willing to work with others, many people with whom he disagrees, to get something done and solve problems. And then I think they need to talk about the real problems that they intend to solve and how they intend to solve them, whether it's the problem of an economic crisis, whether it's the problem of racial or economic injustice, whether it's the problem of too many people who literally can't afford not to go to work and can't afford to stay home either, and all of these real issues. Climate change is real, and it will take both business and government, both Republicans and Democrats, to solve any one of those problems.
Carly, you heard me mention in that conversation John Kasich and Michael Bloomberg and General Colin Powell, this growing list of Republican endorsements. Do you think that it actually changes opinions? Does it move the needle at all?
I don't know, but I'll tell you, unlike previous elections, perhaps, I think the specifics of policy in a weird way and the specifics of who is endorsing whom matter much less than two very important things. Number one, how is it that Donald Trump and Joe Biden behave over the next 60, whatever it is, days? What are their actions? What are their choices? What is their behavior? I think people are watching both of them very closely. Will Joe Biden act in a way that unifies the nation? Will Donald Trump continue to act in a way that divides the nation? And the second most important thing is who comes out to vote. And so I think this is very much about mano a mano. Who is it that you think is a better leader for this nation? Who has the character and the energy to help propel this nation forward? Who will unify, who will divide, and who will vote?
Candidate behavior and voter turnout. Carly, here we are, 67 days. A simple question here. Do you think that there are still large swaths of people who haven't already made up their mind for whom they plan to cast their ballot?
I think there are enough people who have not yet made up their mind that it can swing the election. And I think, obviously, there are loads of people who have made up their mind. But as we know, in 2016, and I believe again in 2020, this election will be in no small measure won or lost by people who are watching very carefully. You know, those voters who voted for Obama and then pulled the lever for Trump at the last minute, or the voter who thought they were going to come out and vote and then just decided in the end, nah, I don't like either one of them, I'm not getting out there. So yes, I think there are enough people who haven't decided exactly what they're going to do, who they're going to vote for, or whether they're going to vote at all, who can make the difference. And so I think it's critically important. That's why you saw the Republican convention that you saw, because Republicans are trying to change some minds. Come on. We know perhaps we've made you uncomfortable. Come on back and vote for Trump again. It's why you saw Democrats plead with Americans to get out and vote. So, yeah, I think there are enough people out there who can make the difference.
Carly Fiorina, we'll have to leave it there. Carly, thank you. Look forward to talking again soon. Enjoy your weekend.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.